This is the Renaissance, research and analysis. So now, again, we're back to a research. We did the Black Death research where we had to do all the highlighting. Remember? Let me go back and refresh your memory. So this is the same thing again. Remember, we did what was the Black Death, and this was research. And then when we click on it, we had to watch the video. What was the Black Death? What are the symptoms? And you had to go through this and highlight what's important and then answer the questions. So you have to highlight what's important and answer the questions. That was the Black Death. Now today, we're going to the Renaissance. What was the Renaissance? Where was the Renaissance? When you're reading this information right here, you have to do number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. I'm going to do it with you. You do the rest alone. When you're reading, the prompt up here is the same. It's exactly the same as our image analysis. Determine the socioeconomic and cultural impact of the Renaissance. So when you read the actual research from professors and the history books, again, you're going to underline anything that's social, the way people lived, economic, and cultural, art, science, or religion. As you're reading, you underline that stuff, okay? So if you go back and you look at the image analysis that we did, remember the image analysis, social was green, economic was orange, and cultural was turquoise. So now let's go over here. I'm going to make mine social. I'm going to make mine green. Economic was orange. So look how everything matches. Now I'm going to highlight this stuff, the same colors. See that? Social, economic, cultural. Social, economic, and cultural. Do you see how it all matches? Everything flows and matches. As we read, we're going to highlight orange and green and turquoise. And also, we got to answer the questions on the right. So we're going to do that together. But first, come back over here. What was the Renaissance? We're going to take, oh, whoops, my bad. That's the images. Now we're going to take a look at a video of exploring the Renaissance. What was the Renaissance? So it's like a 5-minute video. In the video, they're going to talk about social, the way people lived, economic, money, and they're going to talk about culture, religion. I want you to keep your eye on those 3. Social, the way people lived, economic, the way they gained wealth, and culture, how they balanced religion and science. Okay? I'm going to play this video. Let me know if there are any problems listening to it.
Greetings, friends. My name's Cosimo. Allow me to be your guide to the sights, sounds, and smells of the Italian Renaissance. So what is the Italian Renaissance? Well, the word Renaissance is a French word that means rebirth. A rebirth is a new beginning, and a new beginning it was. Between the 14th and 17th centuries, some really creative things started happening in Europe, especially in drawing, sculpture, painting, and architecture. During the 1300s, Europe rose out of the Dark Ages. Bubonic plague was a disease which wiped out a lot of the population. Italy was perfectly situated between East and West for overseas trade. The cash came rolling in. The country was made up of independent city-states. The city of Florence was ruled by a family of painters, the Medicis. They used their vast wealth to sponsor the arts and sciences. The true impact of the Renaissance could really be seen in the visual arts. New styles and techniques emerged. The influence of geometry and mathematics could be seen as artists strived for perfection. By the mid-14th century, paintings had very flat, decorative, religious-themed images. All this changed, however, with the arrival of painters like Giotto and Fra Angelico. They studied artists from ancient Greece and Rome and drew from real life. They painted with egg tempera, which was color pigment mixed with egg yolk. They also used gold, which could be flattened as thin as leaves and could be brushed onto the paintings. Our good friend Johannes Gutenberg helped spread these new ideas to the rest of the world with his invention, the printing press. By the early Renaissance, artists painted people more realistically and placed them in three-dimensional settings. The introduction of perspective revolutionized the way buildings and backgrounds were painted. The architecture at the time was also inspired by ancient Greece and Rome. Common features included columns, pilasters, domes. The most famous dome of all was Florence Cathedral, designed by none other than famous engineer and architect Filippo Brunelleschi. These years saw an explosion in creativity. Compositions, meaning where people and objects are placed in a picture, became balanced, proportioned, perfected. The ideas for artworks no longer came just from religion. Oil paints took longer to dry and could be applied thickly or thinly, allowing artists to give their works a much more realistic feel. These artists became the superstars of their day. A true Renaissance man could be a painter, sculptor, architect, engineer, all rolled into one. Some were even inventors, like our good friend Leonardo da Vinci. Michelangelo Buonarroti was also a painter and sculptor, whose crowning achievement was the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome. So what was life like for the men, women, and children of the Renaissance? Men worked as bankers, farmers, or goldsmiths. Women were either silk weavers, midwives, seamstresses, or nuns. Children didn't have it easy either. From the time they learned to put one foot in front of the other, they were expected to work just as hard as the grown-ups. This was a time of style. What you wore and how you wore it was very important. Women wore sweeping gowns, and every man had to wear a hat. They would show off their new threads at a variety of public and sporting events. Popular pastimes included chess, bullfighting, and jousting. Most music at the time was composed solely for the church. However, as with all the arts, new styles were introduced, and music was also made simply for people's entertainment. As with any great action comes a reaction. The perfection achieved in the High Renaissance gave way to a style called mannerism. This brought about a much more stylized approach to painting. Cooler colors were used. Figures were put in more unusual settings and were painted with longer bodies. The Renaissance, which began in Italy, shook everything up and lasted hundreds of years. It led to big achievements in art and science and changed how people think. Until next time, miei amici, arrivederci.
Okay. So now we gained some ideas from that little video about the Renaissance. So now when I come over here, now you may or may not have this little video notes section in your research guide. Okay, if you do not, it's okay. I want to show you from watching that video, how did the Renaissance change the social lives of people, right? And we saw change the social lives of people. They celebrated life, but they also had a tough life still. Men were mostly wanted to be bankers, and
be involved in the trade and businessmen. There's a lot of money to be made in business at this time. Women, what was the gender roles? Women mostly stood home and were like seamstresses, meaning that they made clothes using cloth. We could say that they worked from home, okay, as seamstresses. And kids had to work too. You see how I watched that video, and that's what I got out of it. This is the social lives, right? We said that, I'm sorry, that was going to be green. See on the bottom left, social green. There it is right there. So then I'm going to go and make that green. Right, that's green. How do they gain wealth? Gain wealth was orange. So then I'm going to make that orange. Now when I come back here, right, how do they gain wealth? So it said after the Black Death, Italy was right in the center of this global trade industry, right? After the Black Death, trade and business greatly increased. People made money. How did the Renaissance change the way people looked at religion and science, which is turquoise? Right? Well, they tried to balance out religion and science. And you saw this through the paintings. Remember, they said in the paintings, balance, balance, balance. Okay? Expressed through the art and paintings. That's how you watch a video and take out that information. Now, Mr. D is able to watch the whole video and remember everything and type the answers. You might struggle to do that. So my advice to you is watch the video until you see an answer and then pause the video, type the answer. Watch the video more until you see the next answer. Pause the video, type your answer. So when you watch a video by yourself for any research investigation, you should pause this. There's 3 questions here. You should pause that video at least 3 times. Okay, probably more, but at least 3 times. So now look at that. Celebrated life. Men, women, and kids also worked in business in order to gain wealth, and they tried to balance out religion and science in order to better their lives. Okay? All right. So now, these answers right here, are they closely related to the claim, the image-based claim that we made? If we go back here, although the Black Death was a deadly pandemic that devastated much of Europe, the socioeconomic and cultural impact, social, economic, and cultural of the Renaissance on Western European society, 1350 to 1550. Hey, look, it positively influenced society, economy, and produced cultural expression because people began to celebrate life, gain wealth, and utilize science to improve the world around them. Just from this video, I have highlighted in blue. Look how people celebrated in life. This is how they gained wealth, and this is how they balanced religion and science. It all matches, like detectives. So you use the vocabulary term corroborates. The evidence corroborates, it matches, which makes the evidence stronger. Now let's look at some research. This is secondary research. So the same prompt, we're looking for social evidence, economic evidence, and cultural evidence. As we read, we highlight in those colors and we answer the questions. So when you take a look at these images now, these are all photographs Mr. D took when he was in Florence, Italy. So the Renaissance, it started in this one particular city in Italy. So in 2019, I traveled to Italy and I went to Florence, Italy, and it is beyond a shadow of a doubt the most beautiful city I've ever been to. The level of detail and decoration on literally every single building, it's astounding. It was definitely the most beautiful place I ever went. Now, you saw in the little video, they talked about the Florentine or Florence Cathedral. They call it the Duomo. Really cool. You can see in this photo, I climbed it. So it's, look, I'm on the second floor. You can climb all the way up into the top, all the way into the top part of that building. It's 585 steps all the way to the top of this church. It's one of the biggest churches in the world. It was 95 degrees that day, and I still climbed it all the way to the top. Really cool experience. Tomorrow, I'll show you more pictures. This is a rooftop that I was on, and look at the sunset in the background, and there's the Duomo Church, and there's all the beautiful houses and buildings. It's like a fairy tale, this place. Unbelievable. Look at the church. This is the church I climbed on the left-hand side. And you can see how big, look how big the people are on the bottom of the screen. And look how big it is compared to the church, right? If you look at St. Anne's Church, if you look at some of the churches in Hoboken, oh, it kind of looks like that, Mr. D. And it's true. This is where they get the inspiration from. They copy from these churches, from the Florentine churches, from the city of Florence. And look at the front of this building, the detail on this building. It's unbelievable. So I climbed all the way to the top of this building. You can see how big it is. Tomorrow, I'll show you some video of climbing the steps and walking inside some of these buildings. And then you can see some of the statues that people made. Really, really interesting stuff. Does anybody know who Medusa is in that story right here? Look at the shield. Really, really cool stuff. You have genius artists that lived at this time, in which rich people who gained the wealth, they paid the genius artists to beautify the city. They loved their city. There are people who love Hoboken and have pride. They have Red Wing pride. And there are people who love Jersey City and they love where they live and they love their town. They love their school. They love their sports. Well, this city in Florence, Italy, these people loved their city. And they tried to use their wealth to make it the most beautiful city in the world. I can make a solid argument. It still is one of, if not the most beautiful city in the world. Okay. So those are just some personal images. I'll show you more tomorrow. On the right-hand side, I'm going to give you 60 seconds. By looking at those pictures, you can ask me personal questions. Type them in. See, list 3 things you see in the image. Think based on what you see. What's the image of? And wonder. Give me 2 questions. You can ask me about my trip. You can ask me about the buildings. You can ask me about the story. Whatever you want. Type see, think, wonder now. Do that now. See, think, wonder. Please fill that out. I mean, someone's got to ask me about that sculpture in the center of the photo there. Strange stuff going on. So over 1,000 years before this little city ever existed, there was a place called Rome, about 4 hours south of the city of Florence, about 4 hours south. Think we're in New Jersey. If you were to drive to Washington, D.C., 4 hours, that far away. So 4 hours south of Florence, Italy, there is a place called Rome. Now, this is over 1,000 years before Florence existed. Rome became one of the greatest cities that ever existed. At the beginning of Rome, okay, about 750 BC, long time ago, before the city of Florence that you're looking at the images of, Rome started off as this little village. And the village was populated with thieves and ex-convicts and people that no one wanted to be around. And they decided to start their own little village. And they wanted it to grow, and they wanted it to grow into a city. So the men were the ones that populated this city. And the men, as the story goes, the men wanted women so they can have babies with the women and populate their little town into a city. So as the story goes, the men went into another nearby village of these people called the Sabines. And in the middle of the night, the men stole all their women and brought them back to the village of Rome. And they forced them to make babies with them in order to populate this village of Rome, to build it into a city. And the story is depicted in that statue. You can see the sculpture, and the title of the sculpture is called The Rape of the Sabines. So over 1,000 years later, artists during the Renaissance in Florence, Italy, wanted to remind people of what happened during the time of Rome. They wanted to copy Roman art and architecture. So they wanted to remind the people of Florence of the stories of ancient Rome. So a sculpture was made reminding everybody of the rape of the Sabine women in order to build the city of ancient Rome. And it gets people talking about ancient Rome and what was the negatives, what was the positive, what was the great things they did. They built monumental architecture in ancient Rome. Hey, this is Florence. Let's build monumental architecture too, to show that we were as great as ancient Rome. Check it out. So that's the story behind the sculpture. And it takes an artistic genius to sculpt something out of like that out of rock. And the shield is a story of Greek mythology. If you ever heard of the Greek man called Perseus, and he has to fight Medusa, and he cuts Medusa's head off, and the snake's on the head of Medusa, mythological Greek god. If you look at Medusa, you turn to stone. And this is the story depicted on the shield of Medusa's head being cut off. Now you have ancient Greek stories about the greatness of ancient Greece. The people of Florence wanted to copy what they believed were the two greatest civilizations that ever existed. Let's copy them and make our city just as great. And now you can see in these images the lengths that people of Florence went to make their city look beautiful. Okay, let's move on. Remember, social, the way people lived, in green; economic in orange; cultural, the balance between art, science, and religion, in turquoise. Follow me. Let's read. Characteristics of the Renaissance. Let's see if this matches up with all of our evidence. Directions. Review the characteristics of Renaissance described below. Then answer the question about them. You will refer to the characteristics when completing the Renaissance examples. Okay. So let's look at the questions before we read. Where did the Renaissance scholars get Greek and Roman texts, books, that were previously lost in Europe? We're learning more about these Renaissance people in Florence. So now we're learning that they gained Greek and Roman books, texts that they learned from. So where did they get them from is our first question. What languages did Renaissance scholars have to learn to study Greek and Roman texts? And how did Renaissance architects learn how to build buildings Greek and Roman style? So let's take a look. After the fall of Rome, This is 1,000 years before Florence. Many of the art and literature that was created by the ancient Greeks and Romans was lost. Because of the disorder caused by the fighting between kingdoms, a lack of education for people outside of the clergy, the church, and a lack of wealth supported artistic creation. Okay. So you don't have a lot of money in a city, the city's not going to look beautiful. Artists are not going to decorate it. All right. Starting in the 1300s, now we're in Florence. Scholars, artists, and scientists in Italy, they rediscovered Greek and Roman writings and art. They modeled everything they did on what they learned from the ancient texts and artifacts. Ooh, question one is, where do they get them? Let's see. Much of which came to them from Constantinople in the Ottoman Empire, where the text had been preserved and often translated in Arabic. Ah, so this place called Constantinople, you're following me. The Ottoman Empire. Okay. Where they were kept. Okay. Constantinople, which is another city, which was the eastern part of the ancient Roman Empire. The Roman Empire collapsed. Most of the books were kept in that city. Now, people from Florence are coming back from traveling to Constantinople, and they're like, we've got amazing stories of one of the most beautiful, or two of the most beautiful cities that ever existed. Let's make Florence like that. Okay. Now, the second question, what languages did Renaissance scholars have to learn in order to read those books? Renaissance writers learned Greek and Latin. Ah, Greek. See that? Follow me. You should be typing the answers. Renaissance writers learned Greek and Latin, the language of the Roman Empire, and studied the style and grammar used by writers like Cicero, a Roman philosopher and politician. Can you imagine going into your closet, finding a book that's 1,000 years old, reading it, and it changing your life? Probably not. But this is what happened to these people. Number 3, how did the Renaissance architects learn the building techniques of ancient Greek and Roman architects? In art, Renaissance painters and sculptors tried to match the realistic depiction of the human form that the Greeks and Romans valued. That's why you see a lot of nudity. It symbolizes freedom, but it also symbolizes the natural state of a man, what a man should look like, what a woman should look like, the beauty of nudity. Then the Renaissance artists pushed themselves to create idealized versions of the human form in both sculpture and painting. Architects were influenced by the Greeks and Romans. They studied Greek and Roman ruins to gain inspiration and figure how classical buildings were constructed. Renaissance architects employed those techniques and improved upon them. All right, number 3. Renaissance painters and sculptors studied Greek and Roman ruins. Anyone know where City Hall is? Right across from Carlos Bakery on Washington Street, all the way down on First, with all the steps. You look up at City Hall and you see those giant, they look like giant stone poles or pillars. Those are ancient Greek and Roman. Does anybody know the Walgreens on Washington Street and 2nd used to be a bank? The entire building is built in the style of ancient Greek and Roman architecture. Hoboken copied ancient Greece and ancient Rome everywhere in our city. If we were to walk around the city, we can point it out. Okay, so that's how you answer questions 1, 2, and 3. Make sure you have those highlights. I'm going to highlight them in blue because they're a different color. These are my answers. Right, and that's where I found my answers. What subjects, number 4, what subjects that you study in school would be considered humanities? Well, it is not math. But what else could it be? The humanities. What other subject is closely related to English? You're sitting in it right now. If you don't know, you better ask somebody. Type the second one, number 4. You guessed it. All right. Number 5, identify someone who might be considered a modern day Renaissance person. Why did you pick that person? That's for you to answer. When they say that's a Renaissance man today, or they say that's a Renaissance girl, Renaissance female, that's a Renaissance person, that means they can do everything well. Wow, that person dresses to the nines every day, and that person's so smart, and that person's so physically, athletically talented, and that person is artistically talented, and that person can sing. Think about maybe a friend you have who's really good at sports, really good at playing a musical instrument, really good at acting, really good person that everyone wants to be friends with, has really good fashion. Maybe they've got lyrical skills. Maybe they've got great athletic skills. Think about that. Maybe you want to name somebody you know like that and say why you think they're a Renaissance person. Someone who can do several things well. That's a Renaissance person. Okay, let's look at number 2, humanism. What is humanism? Humanism was an intellectual thinking movement that emphasized the study of subjects known as the liberal arts or the humanities, including grammar, logic, poetry, philosophy, and history. When they say humanities, they're talking about English class and history class. This is where it came from. Students of humanist teachers took classes in which they learned Greek and Latin, and they studied Greek and Roman literature, philosophy, and history to learn how to be knowledgeable scholars, public speakers, and politicians. Now, I would go back here and I would say that right there is social, the way people wanted to live in Florence, Italy during the Renaissance. Okay, highlight that. Emphasis on the individual. People in the Renaissance, they celebrated individuals for their achievements. They were especially impressed by what they call Homo universalis, or the universal people, or what is known as the Renaissance man. The Renaissance man were well-rounded and accomplished in all fields. The ideal person was a well-educated humanist, an artist, a scientist, an inventor, a musician, and had impressive physical abilities. Now you see your friend or the person you know who's great at math, great at English, great at football, great at volleyball, great at softball, a great friend, really responsible, has a job, makes money, never gets stressed out, always helps everybody. And you ask your friend, man, how do you do that? You got it together as a Renaissance teenager. Maybe it's you. The emphasis on the individual is apparent in Renaissance art. Artists studied Greek and Roman sculpture and studied anatomy so they could create realistic and later idealized perfect versions of the human form in sculptures and paintings. Okay. Oh, here we go. Celebration of non-religious achievements. So what color was that? That's in cultural. Turquoise. Let's go. During the Middle Ages, Europeans were most concerned with living their lives so they would go to heaven and not hell during the Black Death. But during the Renaissance, they studied Greek and Roman philosophers. Most of them wrote before the Catholic Church existed or before it had very much power in Europe. Renaissance writers, artists, and scientists shifted their focus from celebrating God to celebrating non-religious, academic, artistic, and political achievements that were of this world and not the next. So they're saying, don't worry so much about heaven or hell. Worry about today. Live your life. They're the people who came up with YOLO. They're the people who came up with you only live once, so live your life right now, in the day, in the moment. Let's go. Smile. Enjoy life. That's what they're talking about here. The Catholic Church was still a very important part of European culture, but whereas in the Middle Ages, most art was funded by the church, during the Renaissance, artists and writers were funded. During the Renaissance, artists and writers were funded by both the church and private individuals. Okay? So now that funded, that is orange, economic. Now we're talking about money. Okay? Most artists, they worked at cathedrals during the Renaissance. Paintings and sculptures were created for churches and public spaces. Architecture in the Middle Ages was mostly building Gothic cathedrals. Renaissance building projects were religious and civic, having to do with making the government, the city look beautiful. Okay? I hope this helps to be able to underline and understand this.